In our previous tutorial, we wrote a login application to try and implement the MVC pattern. The login application had a controller servlet, we called it the login servlet, and it had a business service, we called it the login service, and it had views, the login page, and the success page. So the login servlet would take the user ID and the password from the login JSP page and pass on the user ID and password to the login service business service, and the business service would return a value of true or false depending on whether it found the password valid or not. Now, if the password was found valid and the business service returned a value of true, then the login servlet redirected the user to a success.jsp page, and if the result was false in the authentication, then the login servlet redirected the user to a login page again. Now, we're going to make a couple of changes to this application in this tutorial, and we'll learn a couple of things along the way. The first change that I'm planning to make here is to the success.jsp. Now, if you look at the success.jsp, it just has a login successful message. I would like to have a more customized message here. I would like to print the username along with the login successful message. I'd like to have a greeting message. It's a simple message, but I just want to display the username here. And let's start with this for now. Now, what does it take to print the username here? First of all, we do not have the user data in a database anywhere. So when we go to our business service, even our password authentication was a dummy method. So we will have to implement another dummy method to actually get the username. Now, this dummy method will probably take in the user ID as one of the parameters. I think that's the only parameter we need. We'll take the user ID as a parameter, and we will return the username. I'm planning to use a hash map and initialize some users, and when it accepts the user ID and the user ID is one of the initialized users, it'll pull up the corresponding username and then return it. Now, what are the changes I have to make? First, I need to implement that method over here, probably a get username method in the business service. And once I do that, in the login servlet, now I make sure that the login is successful. And then after the login is found successful, I will have to call this method to get the username and pass it on to the success.jsp. Why does the login servlet have to do that? Because the login servlet is the controller. It's the job of the controller to call the methods in the business service and get the results. And the controller's job is also to pass on the results so that it's available to the view, the success.jsp in this case. So that will be the second part of the problem we're trying to solve here. Let's go to the first part, which is to actually implement the method in the business service and then use the controller to access that method. So I'll write my method here. So this will be a public string get username, and it'll take the user ID as parameter. Now, let me initialize some data here so that we are able to send some username. So I'll have a constructor here. And in this constructor, I'll initialize a hash map. I've told this before, but let me tell again, this is something that you would use a database for in a real world scenario. Since we are learning MVC, I'm implementing a dummy business service. So I will have a hash map defined here. Okay, I have the list of users available here. And let me import this. Okay, just some 3 users that I have I've just initialized here. Okay, now Eclipse is throwing these warnings because I have a generic hash map. Let me put the value, since we know both are strings. Let's add this, which is a good idea anyway. Okay, so now we have a hash map in place with 3 users that I have added in the constructor. Now all I need to do is, in this get username, I need to take the user ID and pull out the value of the name, the actual object inside this hash map based on the user ID. Now the user ID could be one of these 3, and I just need to pull up the username for that. So that's a very simple implementation. I just say users dot get, the key is the user ID, and this is what I need to return. So our business service implementation is ready. Now we have the list of users which we have pre-filled. We have seeded data here, and I'm just pulling out the name for the user ID that has been passed. Now this is fine, but let me make another change here. The reason why I'm making this change is this. Now we have a get username method. Now let's say we have a few other details of the user, like maybe the date of birth, or the address, phone number. It could be anything depending on the application. Now it is okay to make it's okay to have different methods for pulling out all those data. We could have a get user phone number and get user address, but the best practice is actually to have a common method and return something called as a user object. So we create an object which contains all this user data, and we can have a common method called the get user details, which takes the user ID and then returns the user object with those data pre-populated in it. Now let me make that change here so that we can see how that works as well. Now instead of returning a string here, I will return what is called as a user object. Now I need to create this user object. I need to create this class. Now let me create the class here. Again, right click, new class. I'll call this the DTO, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. User, finish. Now this user could have a private string username, private string user ID, and a few other details. I'll just leave only these 2 for now. Now the reason why I'm making this as private is that I want it to be a proper Java bean, so I will have getters and setters here. So I'll just go to source, generate getters and setters. I will have getters and setters for both of them. Okay, now save this. So all I need to do is I need to import that class here. Eclipse helps us to do that. Make sure you choose the user of the package that you've created. Okay, now I cannot return just this. I need to return the user object. So let me create a user object. And I will use the setter instead of actually using the values. I need to, because I have declared the fields as private. Set username as users.get of user ID. So I'm pulling up this value from the hash map and I'm passing this to the set username of the user object, so that the user object that we create here will have the username set properly. I will of course also set the user ID. I don't have to do that because I don't plan to use that later, but it's a good idea to set it anyway. Set the user ID as the user ID, the one that I've passed here. So now we have the user object ready with the values filled. Now I'm ready to return this. Now I will return the user object. Of course, I will have to change the method name here because it's no longer a username, it's a get user details. Okay, now again, the beauty of this is, say you add a new field to the user, say you want to add a new phone number, or if you already have a phone number, you want to have a work number and a home number. So in that case, you would not have to go and write a new method here. All you need to do is to add the corresponding value into the user object here, and you don't have to change the signature. The signature would still be the user object. You just have to add the field in the corresponding user object and you are done. So this is the advantage of having this kind of an object that's passed across from the business service to the controller, and this object is what we called as the model in our earlier explanation. So in this case, this is the business service method and the model happens to be just a boolean, but in this case this is again another business service method that we're going to call from the controller, and the model is actually the object that we're going to pass, and this object in a in a real world scenario comes from the database. Now we have the business service implemented. Now let's use that inside the servlet. Now if the result is successful, now if the authentication is successful, then I need to get the user details from the business service. So I will call this method. Now I'll again use the login service. Get user details, and I will pass the user ID. Now this I need to save it somewhere, so I will create a new user object here and I'll capture the return value. Now I need to import the user class here as well, and yes, we are done. So now we have the controller calling the business service and then taking the the return type is the model here, which is the user object. It's capturing this model inside its own variable, and then now we have this first part of the problem resolved. Now this first link is done. Now to the second link. Now the controller has to pass this model to the view. So what's going to happen is in our success.jsp, we need to get this user object and we need to print the user name from this user object. Now